Hello, everyone. It's Charlton, and I want to discuss this couple things. It's all the terrorism thing, okay? And several people brought my attention to this story over True Pundit. I like this publication. Okay, I don't know this dude personally. I don't even know if that's his real name, Thomas Paine, or if that's like a pseudonym that he goes by, on Twitter and stuff. But he's from Philly, and I like the publication. I read it all the time. I look at it for content. So, however, I'm not so sure about, and I think this is going to be the first of several stories that he has sources at the FBI supposedly that the overall gist I think is that they've been trying to cover up an ISIS terrorism link. Okay, and I'm not so sure about this at all, and not so much the story. It goes back to the Waters world with Wayne Allen Root, a talk radio guy in Vegas. Brian Baca brought this to my attention. I listened to the actual show that he had listened to, and I played that in my last video, or a portion of it. And my conclusion, my gut was telling me something the complete opposite of what they were suggesting. They were suggesting that the that MGM Resorts didn't have the insurance rider for terrorism, and so they were trying to avoid any link to terrorism because they weren't covered. And my instincts told me that it would be the other way around, and that in fact, my instincts kind of told me the likelihood would be that they were covered for that they did have insurance for that, and maybe even some other elements to it. And um, you know, I'm not sure what everyone thinks, but it seemed like a lot of people kind of were going along with what Wayne Allen Root was suggesting, as did the attorney that he was speaking with in his radio program. I forget the guy's name. I think it was Claypool. Okay, I looked it up some, and um, I'm not absolutely definitive on this, but the things that I looked up and read kind of confirmed what I believed, which was the opposite of what he was suggesting. Basically, that terrorism, they would be covered. In fact, at some point, it basically, if the government labeled it, designated it an act of terrorism, that's what would be the best for MGM insurance wise and the insurance companies, because basically, at least in part and maybe in large part, the U.S. taxpayer would end up fronting the bill for it, and that's what we're talking about here. I think maybe. So, um, I mean these signals that are being sent out, and I think they're false signals. Maybe I really don't know. I have no idea, but if it just seems strange that all this information is coming out at the same time, that of labeling it an act of terrorism, and yet the research that I've found, it seems as though MGM is covered for terrorism, and some of the laws that were crafted post 9/11 and have been sort of reintroduced or reinstated at different junctions. Um, you know, Basically, it would benefit MGM, I believe, possibly, if it was designated an act of terrorism. Probably any kind of terrorism, whether it's ISIS, related or domestic terrorism. All right, so let me just go to the articles I pulled up from International Business Times, another article from International Business Times, and then something from casino.org. Let me just start here, and then I'll go back to the beginning. But it says right here, and this is from November 13th. This is with regards to Mandalay Bay tragedy expected to cost insurance companies $1 billion. MGM workers claim hours cut, etc. But right here, it says, should the U.S. government have declared the shooting an act of terrorism, insurance companies might have been off the hook. The U.S. Treasury Department has terrorism insurance to alleviate substantial costs that result in terrorism. telling you, if this thing gets designated an act of terrorism, there's basically the government is the reinsurer. Okay, because there's also, I mean, in these massive catastrophic events, there's insurance, then there's reinsurance. It's very complicated. But when you have things like Katrina, acts of terrorism, where the costs are just mammoth, it's not just one insurance company. Then you have insurance companies that provide insurance to the insurance companies, and in this case, um, basically the federal government becomes that entity that provides the insurance for the insurance companies, the reinsurer. And it stems back to September 11th, because after September 11th, several insurance companies are like, no way, we're not providing insurance for terrorism anymore. They basically crafted a law to kind of incentivize insurance companies to provide the insurance for terrorism. And in order to do that, I think they basically backed it up with, where the government would pay part of the bill, and I think initially it was up to 100 million. But since it was reinstated in 2014 or 2015, it pretty much put the taxpayer fronting most of the bill, according to the language in these articles. All right. Again, not to belabor the point, but what I'm saying is this: if this was actually labeled, an act of terrorism, it would benefit MGM, or as I understand it. There is something else called active shooter insurance. Now that's a big question mark whether or not they had active shooter insurance. Okay, but even that, right? Active shooter insurance, it very likely, even if they had it, okay, that it only, most active shooters, you're talking about a few deaths. It's not like you would have something that would cover $1 billion worth of damage for active shooter insurance. All right, you'd expect a few people to be killed, maybe 10 or something like that, but not of this magnitude. Okay, where there's 60 people killed, 500 plus people injured, and the tentacles just go on. So, all right, so here's the one of the international business Times article, and it basically says, in the financial documents reviewed by IBT, MGM Resorts, the owner of Mandalay Bay Hotel, where the alleged shooter was perched, warned investors that insurance policies may not be adequate to cover all losses in the event of a major casualty. And that's where the quote is: may not be adequate to cover all losses in the event of a major casualty, end quote, such as terrorism. And now this person added that, such as terrorism. All right. Now, that's not. I mean, the financial document didn't have that "such as terrorism" in it. All right. In fact, here's a financial document from MGM. It's a lease document. It's an SEC.gov. It's a Securities Exchange document from like 2013, 2014. It's a lease agreement between a landlord, the National Harbor Beltway LC, and the tenant, which is MGM. And because it's obviously a large business transaction or something, they have to provide all this documentation. And then it basically says that that MGM has terrorism insurance for terrorism. And here's and you can. I mean, you just search for the word terrorism, insurance indemnity. Terrorism, terrorism, terrorism. Terrorism. Search for shooter, and you get a big goose egg. All right, zero. That's 2013, 2014. It's a different time, but I'm just saying as an example. Okay. So here, this is dealing with the active shooter insurance question, whether or not they have it. But again, I'm contending that even if they had active shooter insurance, it would have been so much smaller than, I mean, typically terrorism, you're expecting somebody to blow up a building, like something like Timothy McVeigh, where, tens and hundreds of people are killed, and the damage is just catastrophic. Active shooter, you're talking about, some disgruntled employee who, may end up killing one or two people, and the coverage would just be less. It's just like when you're buying, insurance for your homeowner's insurance, and you're sitting down with your agent, and you're deciding how much coverage to get for each element. all right? But in terrorism would be huge. Active shooter, it wouldn't be. But this is just a strange event. So even though, you just didn't have enough insurance for an active shooter, because normally an active shooter wouldn't be something like this, where some guy breaks out a window and has machine guns up there and fires down on the concert. It just wouldn't happen, but it did happen. So, but you wouldn't have insurance for it. So, all right. And I lost. No, I didn't. Okay, so with regards to active shooter insurance, it says, but it also discusses terrorism insurance. And then here it basically said that MGM was ahead of the game, and that unlike some of its competitors in the industry, it did have insurance for terrorism, right? And this article is as of, October 13th, 2017, 12 days after the incident. All right. So it's saying it's unclear whether MGM Resorts had insurance to cover mass violence that has not been designated a terrorist activity by the federal government. An MGM spokesman did not answer questions from IBT on the subject of the company's coverage. But according to its most recent annual financial statement, MGM, unlike some of its main competitors, has all risk property insurance coverage for our operating properties, which covers damage caused by casualty loss, such as fire, natural disasters, act of war, or terrorism. Okay, so it had coverage for terrorism. So it goes on, and now it's starting to talk about the whole thing of how insurance in terrorism had changed after September 11th, and that they came up with a law, TRIA, after September 11th, incentivizing insurance companies to provide the insurance. Because like I said, after September 11th, insurance companies all pulled out, and they're like, no way, we can't provide insurance for this. I mean, the Twin Towers fell to the ground. 3,000 people died. The insurance couldn't possibly cover that. And if that would ever happen again, they just all pulled out. So the government came up with a law to incentivize them to do it, and they backed them up. And they actually reinstated it in 2014 or 2015, which actually beefed it up and made the government even more, basically, back them up, where the taxpayer would be the one who was footing the bill, according to this article. Right. So it says that's likely thanks in part to a federal program created in the wake of September 11, 2001. Attacks, when sellers of terrorism insurance either pulled out of the market, fearing they could face the same market destabilizing $40 billion in costs in 2001 that followed 9/11. All right, the program, called the Terrorism Risk Insurance Act, TRIA, originally enacted as a temporary measure in 2002, provided them with federal reinsurance for attack-related commercial losses of up to $100 billion. After Congress reauthorized it in 2015, it became the Terrorism Risk Insurance Program Reauthorization Act, TRIPA. This model, according to Congressional Budget Office report on the TRIA from 2015, quote, left taxpayers bearing most of the catastrophic risk. Okay? So, and again, back to this same thing from casino.org, should the U.S. government have declared the shooting an act of terrorism, insurance companies might have been off the hook, which would mean MGM's off the hook, both. So, this being declared, a terrorism act, an ISIS terrorism act, domestic terrorism, whatever, would benefit MGM and insurance companies, as I understand it, to the best, the way I read it here. I could have that wrong, and that's what I'm saying here, man. I think hopefully I made that clear, and that's the end of this video, man. Thanks for watching my videos. Please subscribe to my channel. Give me a like down below, and I'll see you in the next video. Later, man.